Her true story from California. My son said, "I don't need you anymore," after I paid off his debts, so I took everything back. The wine was a deep, arrogant red, the kind that costs more than my weekly grocery budget. It swirled in glasses held by hands adorned with watches that gleamed under the track lighting of my son's new, minimalist dining room. Laughter, sharp and loud, echoed off the polished concrete floors. It was the sound of success, or at least the performance of it. I, Margaret Thompson, was where I usually was, on the periphery, in the kitchen. I arranged the last of the canapé smoked salmon on rye crisps, a recipe I'd perfected over 30 years onto a slate platter. My hands, spotted with age but still steady, moved with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has spent a lifetime serving. I wiped them on my simple black apron, a stark contrast to the designer silk my daughter-in-law, Chloe, was wearing, and carried the tray out to their guests. The dining room felt like a museum of modern success. Everything was sharp angles and expensive materials, the kind of aesthetic that screams money but whispers nothing about the people who live there. Glass and steel, concrete and leather, cold surfaces that reflected light but absorbed no warmth. Even the art on the walls looked like it had been purchased by the square foot rather than chosen with love. David, my son, stood at the center of the room, one hand in the pocket of his tailored slacks, the other holding a glass of that expensive wine. He was telling a story, gesturing broadly, his face flushed with a confidence I hadn't seen since before I sold my home. At 34, he had grown into the kind of man who filled a room not with presence, but with volume. His voice carried the particular cadence of someone who had learned to speak in boardrooms, each word carefully modulated to project authority. It was about vision, he was saying, his voice booming across the open-plan space. Everyone told me it was a risk. Everyone had their doubts. The market was saturated, they said. The technology wasn't mature enough, they said. But Chloe and I, we knew. We saw the gaps that others couldn't see. We bootstrapped everything. We sacrificed. We believed in the project when no one else would. I paused at the edge of the conversation circle, holding my tray of carefully arranged canapés. These people didn't know Meadow them. I was simply part of the household staff, another amenity in David and Chloe's curated life. A woman with a tray of food, invisible in the way that service workers always are to people like this. A man with a silver watch and a slick haircut nodded appreciatively. His suit probably cost more than I used to spend on groceries in 3 months. Incredible turnaround, David. From 0 to a 7-figure valuation in 18 months, you're the talk of the valley. The resilience you showed during those early months, it's inspiring. A woman in a burgundy dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent leaned forward. I heard you had to pivot twice before you found your sweet spot. That takes real courage. David's chest puffed with pride. It wasn't easy. There were nights when Chloe and I would sit at this very table, surrounded by spreadsheets and empty coffee cups, wondering if we were chasing a dream or just being naive. But we never gave up. We knew we had something special. Chloe beamed, placing a possessive hand on David's arm. At 28, she was everything I wasn't tall where I was short, blonde where I was gray, sharp where I was soft. Her beauty was the kind that required constant maintenance, weekly salon appointments, monthly spa treatments, quarterly cosmetic procedures. It was a beauty that announced itself loudly and expected to be heard. "He's a genius," she purred, her voice carrying that particular breathiness that some women adopt when they want to sound both seductive and helpless. He just needed the freedom to create without any baggage. Her eyes flickered toward me for a fraction of a second, a look as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. The word baggage hung in the air like smoke. I understood its meaning perfectly. I was the baggage, the mother who had moved in with them 18 months ago. The elderly woman who cooked their meals and cleaned their house and asked for nothing more than a place to sleep and the occasional kind word. I offered the tray to the circle of guests. "Canapés, everyone?" I said softly, my voice barely registering above the ambient noise of success. The conversation paused as hands reached for the food. a few polite murmurs of delicious and lovely presentation. I felt a small, foolish flicker of pride. These were the same canapés I had served at faculty parties when Robert was alive, when we hosted his colleagues from the accounting firm in our cozy suburban home. The recipe had traveled with me from my old life to this new one of the few constants in a world that had shifted beneath my feet. Then David cleared his throat, ready to resume his monologue. I turned to go back to the kitchen, but he stopped me, not with a word but with a look that said, "Stay, listen to this. Remember your place in this story." He raised his glass, the wine catching the light like liquid ruby. "I want to propose a toast," he announced, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation, "to new beginnings. To cutting ties with the past and building your own future, on your own terms. To surrounding yourself with people who believe in your vision, not people who hold you back." The room erupted in applause. Wine glasses clinked together in a symphony of celebration. As I stood there, holding the empty slate platter, I felt a familiar chill, the same chill that had settled in my chest 6 months ago when I sat in a sterile bank office, signing away the last of my retirement savings. The party wound down late, as these things always did. Important people had important schedules, but they also had important images to maintain, and leaving too early would suggest that this gathering wasn't worth their time. I stayed, as I always did, to clean. I had learned the rhythm of these evenings, the gradual exodus of guests, the lingering conversations by the door, the final farewells that stretched into lengthy business discussions. I gathered empty glasses sticky with wine residue, scraped gourmet cheeses from bamboo boards, and loaded the dishwasher with the quiet reverence of a nun preparing for evening prayers. The kitchen, at least, was familiar territory. Here, among the gleaming appliances and granite countertops, I could move with purpose. The dishwasher hummed its mechanical lullaby. The garbage disposal ground up the remnants of success. No one thanked me. David and Chloe had already disappeared upstairs, their laughter floating down the open staircase like smoke from a fire I wasn't invited to warm myself by. I was wiping down the granite countertops when David came back down, dressed now in a casual sweatshirt and jeans. The transformation was striking from boardroom executive to suburban homeowner in the space of a wardrobe change. He walked past me to the refrigerator, pulled out a bottle of water, and began scrolling through his phone. "Good party," I said, trying to keep my voice light and conversational. "It was a business dinner, Mom, not a party," he corrected, his back still to me. His voice carried that particular edge of irritation that I had grown accustomed to over the past months, the tone of someone who was constantly having to explain obvious things to someone who just didn't understand the modern world. "Well, your new partners seem very impressed," I offered, wringing out the dishcloth and hanging it carefully on its designated hook. He turned then, and the look on his face was one I knew too well. It was a mixture of irritation and impatience, the expression of a busy person whose valuable time was being wasted by small talk. "Look, can I ask you something?" "Of course, dear." He set his water bottle down on the counter I had just cleaned. "That comment you made earlier about me landing on my feet, don't do that again." I paused, my hand frozen halfway to the dish towel. "I was just saying I was proud of how you—" "It sounds like you're taking credit," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut. "It sounds like you're reminding everyone that we needed help. We've moved past that. It's done. Ancient history." The words hit me like a physical blow. Ancient history. As if the sacrifice of my entire life savings was just a footnote in his success story. "David, I only meant." He held up a hand, the universal gesture for stop talking. "I know what you meant, but we're trying to build a new image here, a new brand. We can't have you in the background looking like the poor relation we took in. It undermines everything we've worked for." Poor relation. The words landed like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples that spread outward in ever-widening circles of hurt. After I had paid off his debt of $175,000, a debt he'd accumulated from a failed tech startup called Next Gen Solutions, a venture built on bad decisions, extravagant spending, and the kind of naive optimism that mistakes enthusiasm for business acumen. a debt that was about to bankrupt him, ruin his credit for a decade, and lose them the very house they were standing in. I remembered that day so clearly. David had sat at my old kitchen table, surrounded by the comfortable clutter of a life well lived. Robert's coffee mug still unwashed in the sink, my reading glasses on top of a stack of graded papers, the African violet on the windowsill that had bloomed faithfully for 15 years. He had spread the foreclosure notices across the oak surface like playing cards in a losing hand. "I don't think I look like a poor relation," I said now, my voice barely a whisper. He sighed, the sound of a man burdened by a problem he wished would just disappear. "It's not what you think, Mom. It's what other people think. This is Silicon Valley. Image is everything, perception is reality, and frankly," he hesitated, then plunged forward with a cruelty that stole my breath. "I don't need you anymore. We're fine on our own now. More than fine, we're thriving." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the dishwasher seemed to pause in its cycle. I stared at him, this man who had once been my baby, my toddler, my little boy who had crawled into my bed during thunderstorms and asked me to check for monsters under his bed. The boy I had taught to ride a bike in the park behind our old house, running alongside him with my hand on his back until he found his balance. The teenager whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose broken hearts I had mended with chocolate chip cookies and patient listening. The young man whose college tuition I had helped pay for by taking on extra tutoring classes for 23 years, sacrificing my evenings and weekends so he could graduate debt-free. "I see," I said. The two words felt heavy, final, like the closing of a book. "It's probably best if you start looking for your own place," he continued, unable to meet my eyes. His gaze wandered around the kitchen, where I had cooked thousands of meals, where I had made his favorite birthday cakes, where I had sat with him during his divorces and career setbacks and moments of doubt. Something small, manageable, age, appropriate, will even help with the first month's rent. It's just better for everyone this way. Age appropriate, as if I had become a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I didn't remind him of the sleepless nights I'd had, worrying about his business failures and relationship troubles. I didn't mention the comfortable life I had given up, the home I had sold, the future I had mortgaged for his present. I just nodded slowly, picked up my sponge, and finished wiping the counter until it shone like a mirror. He watched me for a moment, then, apparently satisfied that the unpleasantness was over, he turned and went back upstairs. I stood alone in the silent, gleaming kitchen. The appliances hummed their electronic songs. The ice maker dropped cubes into its bin with a sound like dice being thrown. In his mind, the transaction was complete. My purpose had been served, my usefulness exhausted. But he had forgotten one small detail. He had forgotten about the document I made him sign. He thought it was just a formality, a simple IOU between family members. I knew it was a receipt for my life. And now, I was going to cash it in. My late husband, Robert, had been an accountant for 42 years, a man of numbers, ledgers, and foresight. He had weathered 3 recessions, 2 market crashes, and countless economic upheavals by understanding one simple truth: hope for the best, but document everything else. "Love is essential, Margaret," he used to say, tapping his pen on a stack of papers spread across our dining room table, "but documentation is forever. Love can fade, memories can distort, but a signature on a legal document, that's immortal." Robert had been the kind of man who read every word of every contract, who kept receipts for decades, who understood that in a world governed by law, the person with the best paperwork usually won. He taught me to save, to invest, to read the fine print. When he passed away 5 years ago from a heart attack that took him as suddenly as a summer storm, he left me with a paid-off home in a quiet suburban neighborhood and a retirement fund we had built together over 40 years of careful, methodical living. It was supposed to be my safe harbor, my reward for a life of hard work and sacrifice. The house had been our sanctuary, a 3-bedroom ranch style with a front porch where we had watched 30 seasons change, a backyard where Robert had grown tomatoes and I had tended my rose garden. Every room held memories. The living room where we had watched David take his first steps, the kitchen where we had hosted countless dinner parties, the bedroom where Robert had died peacefully in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in March. Then came David's crisis. It started with frantic phone calls at odd hours, then tearful confessions in my cozy living room. The startup was a disaster. Next Gen Solutions was hemorrhaging money faster than a punctured artery. His investors were pulling out like rats, abandoning a sinking ship. He and Chloe were on the verge of losing everything: the house they had bought in the trendy part of town, the cars, the lifestyle they had built on borrowed money and unbridled optimism. "I just need a bridge loan, Mom," he'd pleaded, his face pale with panic, dark circles under his eyes from weeks of sleepless nights. "Just to tide us over until I can restructure the debt. I'll pay you back, I swear. Every penny, with interest if you want. I just need time." He had spread the papers across my coffee table like evidence in a trial: bank statements, foreclosure notices, credit card bills with balances that made my hands shake. The numbers were staggering. $175,000 in accumulated debt, credit cards maxed out at 29% interest, a mortgage that was 4 months behind, business loans that were being called in by nervous lenders. I loved my son. What mother wouldn't help her child in their darkest hour? But Robert's voice echoed in my head, as clear as if he were sitting beside me on our old sofa. "Documentation is forever." The decision to help was easy. The method required careful consideration. I could have simply written him a check, could have transferred the money with a handshake and a mother's blessing. But Robert had taught me better than that. Love without boundaries becomes enabling. Generosity without structure becomes exploitation. I sold the house I'd shared with my husband, the house filled with 40 years of memories, where I had expected to spend my final decades. I walked through each room one last time before the closing, touching the walls that had held our life together, saying goodbye to the garden where Robert's ashes were scattered among the roses. The real estate market was strong, and our little ranch sold for more than we had ever imagined it would be worth. After fees and taxes, I netted $210,000, enough to pay off David's debt and still have something left for my own uncertain future. I moved into a small rental apartment across town, a 1-bedroom unit in a complex designed for seniors. It was clean and safe, but it felt like living inside a beige box. The walls were thin, the appliances were basic, and there was no garden, just a small balcony overlooking a parking lot. With the proceeds from the house sale, I cashed out a significant portion of my retirement fund, paying the early withdrawal penalties and taxes with the resignation of someone who had run out of better options. I took $175,000, my security, my past, and my future, and went with David to First National Bank on a Tuesday morning in September. I watched the teller transfer the sum that represented my entire life's work into his account. The numbers on the screen seemed impossibly large and impossibly small, at the same time large enough to save his business, small enough to disappear in a few careless months. But before I authorized the transfer, I had my own papers drafted. Not by a high-priced attorney, but by me, using legal templates I had researched online and language I had crafted with the precision of someone who had spent 30 years teaching high school English. I understood the power of words, the importance of clarity, the difference between what people say and what they mean. I put the document in front of him at my old kitchen table, the same table where he had spread his financial crisis like a plague map. It was a promissory note, typed on my computer and printed on heavy paper that gave it the weight of significance. It detailed the full amount, acknowledged it as a personal loan rather than a gift, and set a generous, zero-interest repayment schedule to begin in 5 years, enough time for him to rebuild his business and establish financial stability. "Just so we're clear on the terms, honey," I'd said, my voice gentle but firm. "I want us both to understand what we're agreeing to." He barely glanced at it, so relieved to be saved from financial ruin. His signature was a hasty scrawl at the bottom of the page, the penmanship of someone whose mind was already racing ahead to salvation. But he never read the fine print. He never read Clause 4B. Clause 4B was my masterpiece of foresight, born from a flicker of unease I had seen in Chloe's eyes, that dire look that suggested this transaction was not between a mother and son, but between a mark and a con artist. The clause was written in clear, unambiguous language that would hold up in any court in the country. It stated that if the borrower David Thompson at any point secured new independent business financing or entered into a partnership valued at over $100,000, or received investment capital of any kind, the full principal amount of $175,000 would become immediately due and payable within 30 business days of the new funding's acquisition. He thought it was a safety net, a way to protect my investment by ensuring he would pay me back once he was financially stable. It was a tripwire, designed to activate the moment he achieved the success he was so desperate to attain. And that night, at his business dinner, he had sprinted right through it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the small guest room they'd given me, a room that felt more like storage space than living space, filled with their old furniture and exercise equipment they no longer used. The air was thick with the cloying scent of Chloe's vanilla candles, and the walls were painted a shade of beige that seemed designed to discourage human habitation. I went over the plan in my head with the methodical precision of a chess player contemplating her next 20 moves. There was no anger in my calculations, no rage fueling my decisions. Just a profound, chilling clarity, the same clarity a surgeon must feel before making the first incision, knowing exactly where to cut and how deep to go. The next morning, I packed my 2 suitcases while they were at their morning workout session at the exclusive gym where they maintained their images as successful entrepreneurs. I didn't take much, just my clothes, my late husband's photograph in its silver frame, a few books that had traveled with me from house to house, and the locked metal file box from the back of my closet. That box contained the documents that would change everything: the original promissory note, bank records, and copies of every transaction that had led to this moment. I left a short, simple note on the perfectly made bed. "David, I've decided to take your advice and find my own place. Thank you for your honesty last night. I'll be in touch soon. Love, Mom." I took a taxi to a modest, extended-stay hotel across town, the kind of place that catered to business travelers and people in transition. It was clean, anonymous, and quiet. The room had a small kitchenette, a desk where I could work, and a phone line that wasn't connected to David's house or his life. From there, I made my first call. "Gable, Associates," a crisp voice answered. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Gable, please. It's Margaret Thompson." Arthur Gable had been Robert's friend and lawyer for 30 years. They had met in college, served as each other's best men, and maintained a friendship that had survived careers, marriages, children, and Robert's death. Arthur was semi-retired now, a widower like me who spent most of his days tending his rose garden and reading legal journals, but he still kept his license active for old clients and old friends. "Margaret," he said, his voice warm with surprise and genuine affection. "It's been too long. How are you holding up?" "I'm well, Arthur, but I need to see you. It's about a promissory note." "Of course. Can you come by the office this afternoon?" Arthur's office was exactly as I remembered, IATA testament to decades of successful legal practice. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, a mahogany desk that had probably cost more than most people's cars, and windows that looked out over the city where he had built his reputation one case at a time. I laid the original document on his desk with the care of someone placing evidence before a jury. He put on his reading glasses, the same wire-rimmed spectacles he had worn for as long as I had known him, and read the promissory note slowly, his expression shifting from curiosity to understanding to something that might have been admiration. He read Clause 4B twice, then looked up at me over the rim of his glasses. "Margaret, this is ironclad, absolutely bulletproof. Did he trigger it?" "Last night," I said, my voice steady as a metronome. "They secured a new partnership, a valuation in the 7 figures, according to my son's presentation to his investors." Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "And how do we prove that?" I pulled out my phone and showed him the evidence that Chloe, in her infinite vanity and need for social media validation, had provided. Her Instagram account was a public declaration of their new venture, a carefully curated gallery of success and achievement. The first post showed her and David signing papers with their new partners, all smiles and champagne glasses. The caption read, "The future is bright. Thrilled to announce our partnership with VTech Capital. Big things coming. Entrepreneur, success, living the dream." Another post featured a link to a press release from a local business journal detailing the acquisition and the initial seed funding of $500,000. The article described David's company, now rebranded as T-Analytics, as a promising data visualization startup with revolutionary applications in the fintech sector. Arthur studied the screen, scrolling through the evidence with the thoroughness of someone who had spent decades building cases from digital breadcrumbs. A slow smile spread across his weathered face. "Oh, my dear Margaret," he said, shaking his head with something between admiration and sympathy. "They never learn, do they? In this age of social media, everyone's their own prosecutor." "I need you to send the demand letter," I said, my voice as calm as still water. "To his business address, not the house. Make it official." He was already reaching for a legal pad, his pen moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had drafted thousands of similar documents. "Consider it done. They'll receive a formal demand for immediate and full repayment by certified courier tomorrow morning. 30 days to comply, as specified in the original agreement." I felt a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying begin to lift from my shoulders. "Thank you, Arthur." "Don't thank me yet," he said, his eyes kind but serious. "This is going to get ugly before it gets better. Family lawsuits always do. Are you prepared for what comes next?" I thought about David's words from the night before. "I don't need you anymore," about Chloe's dismissive glances and casual cruelty, about the 18 months I had spent living like a ghost in a house I had helped save. "I'm prepared," I said. He nodded, understanding passing between us like a shared secret. "Then let's collect what's owed to you. Robert would be proud of your preparation." For the next 2 weeks, there was only silence, the kind of heavy, pregnant silence that precedes a storm. I knew the letter had been delivered. Arthur had confirmed it with the courier service. I imagined the scene, the sleek envelope arriving at their glass, walled office in the tech district, David's confusion as he signed for it, his initial dismissal of what he probably assumed was junk mail or a solicitation. Then the moment of recognition, the dawning horror as he read the legal language and finally understood the clause he had never bothered to examine. I used the time productively. I found a new home, not a house, but a comfortable one-bedroom apartment in a well-maintained building designed for active seniors. It had a balcony big enough for a few pots of herbs, a view of the distant hills that reminded me of the sunsets Robert and I used to watch from our back porch, and neighbors who were in similar life transitions. The building had amenities I hadn't enjoyed in years, a library where residents could borrow books and attend discussion groups, a community garden where I could grow tomatoes like Robert used to, and a social room where people played cards and shared stories. It felt like a place where I could rebuild a life rather than simply exist in the margins of someone else's. I paid the first 6 months' rent in cash, using money from the savings account I had maintained separately from the funds I had given David. I bought simple, sturdy furniture, nothing expensive or pretentious, just pieces that would serve their purpose and bring me comfort. For the first time in over a year, I felt like I could breathe freely. The call came on a Tuesday evening, exactly 2 weeks after Arthur had sent the demand letter. I was watering a small pot of rosemary on my new balcony, the herb's sharp scent reminding me of the Mediterranean cookbook Robert had given me for our 20th anniversary. My phone rang, and David's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring 3 times before I answered, taking the time to set down my watering can and compose myself. "Hello? Mom, what is this? What have you done?" His voice was a frantic whisper, the sound of a man whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. I said nothing, letting the silence stretch between us like a taut wire. "This letter, from a lawyer, it's demanding the full amount, $175,000. It says we have to pay it now, immediately. This has to be a mistake. There's no way this is real. The panic in his voice was almost tangible, transmitted through the phone line like an electric current. I could hear Chloe in the background, her voice shrill and demanding answers he didn't have. "It's not a mistake, David," I said calmly, my voice steady as a judge pronouncing sentence. "It's Clause 4B of the contract you signed." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. I could practically hear the gears turning in his head as he tried to remember, tried to recall the document he had signed so casually, so carelessly. I don't remember any clause like that," he stammered. "I know," I replied, and there was no accusation in my voice, just the simple statement of fact. "You were in a hurry that day, you had other things on your mind. But we can't pay this now. The money is tied up in the business. It's our seed funding, our operating capital. If our partners find out we have this kind of personal debt, they'll pull out. You'll ruin us. After everything we've worked for." Everything we've worked for. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had already consumed everything combustible. I let him continue, let him exhaust himself with explanations and justifications, and increasingly desperate bargaining attempts. Chloe had apparently grabbed the phone at some point. "This is insane," she shrieked, her carefully modulated voice cracking under pressure. "You can't do this to us. We're family." "Family," I repeated quietly, tasting the word like wine that had turned to vinegar. "Yes, you reminded me of that just 2 weeks ago, when you told me I was baggage. When you said I was undermining your success just by existing in the same house." "Mom, please." David was back on the line now, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "I was an idiot. I was stressed, overwhelmed. I didn't mean any of it." "You know I didn't mean it. Please, just call off the lawyer. We can go back to the original plan. We'll pay you back according to the original schedule, I promise." "A promise is just words, David," I said, looking out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. "A signature on a legal document is a voice, and I'm finally listening to what it's saying." I hung up before he could respond, and immediately blocked both their numbers. Then I unplugged the landline in my apartment and sat down with a cup of chamomile tea. The silence was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. They showed up a week later, on a Sunday afternoon, when the autumn light was slanting through my new apartment in Golden Bars. I saw them through the security camera in the lobby. David's shoulders slumped in defeat, Chloe looking pale and diminished without her usual armor of designer clothes and professional makeup. They both looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of their circumstances had physically compressed them. David's usual confident posture had collapsed into something hunched and defensive. Chloe's sharp edges seemed to have been worn smooth by worry and sleepless nights. I buzzed them in because I wanted to see this through to its conclusion. I wanted to look them in the eye and confirm what I already knew, that desperate people make desperate choices, and desperate choices reveal character in ways that comfortable choices never can. They stood in the doorway of my small, neat apartment, looking around with barely concealed bewilderment. This wasn't the luxurious space they inhabited, with its soaring ceilings and designer furniture. This was a place where function mattered more than form, where comfort trumped status. "Mom," David began, his voice carrying none of its usual authority, "we've been to 3 different banks. We tried to get a personal loan, a business line of credit, even a second mortgage. They won't approve anything on such short notice. The underwriters are asking too many questions. We don't have the money." Chloe stepped forward, her usual predatory confidence replaced by something that looked almost like humility. "The partnership with VTech is falling apart," she said, her voice tight with suppressed panic. "They're concerned about our financial stability. If they find out about this debt, they'll walk away from the deal. Everything we've worked for will be gone." I motioned for them to sit on my small sofa, comfortable piece I had chosen for myself, not to impress anyone else. I remained standing, looking down at them with the calm detachment of someone who had finally found her footing after months of uncertainty. "I have a solution," I said. A flicker of hope ignited in David's eyes like a match struck in darkness. "Anything. We'll do anything. Just tell us how to fix this." I walked over to my small writing desk and picked up a single sheet of paper. It was a new agreement, drafted by Arthur that morning with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "I will forgive the full amount of the debt," I said, letting the words settle in the air like dust after an explosion. The relief that washed over their faces was so profound it was almost painful to witness. Chloe actually sagged forward, as if someone had cut the strings that had been holding her upright. "Oh, thank God," she whispered. "Thank you, Margaret. Thank you so much." "On one condition," I continued, holding up the paper between us like a barrier. David nodded eagerly, too desperate to be cautious. "Name it, whatever you want. You sign over to me a 60% equity stake in T Analytics." The words fell into the room like stones dropped into still water. The silence that followed was absolutino traffic noise from outside, no hum of appliances, no sound of breathing. Just the weight of numbers and percentages and the mathematics of power. 60%? Chloe whispered, the words barely audible. That's a controlling interest. That's everything we have." "Yes," I said simply, "it is." David shook his head slowly, as if trying to dispel a bad dream. "You can't be serious. You don't know anything about our business. You don't understand the technology, the market, the competition." "I know how to read a balance sheet," I replied, my voice as cool as winter morning. "Robert taught me that, along with many other useful skills. I know that your company was built on a foundation that I provided."